We are just in the heart of verbs here in Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, and I trust that you are getting traction with these verbs as you read your Greek New Testament each day as well. And here, the aorist and future passives. Let's pray together. Lord, minister to students, help them as they're reading their text, help them to differentiate between the present and the imperfect, the aorist and the future, and now with the aorist and future passives. Help them to catch the tense formatives here and the patterns. Give them discipline and encouragement in the midst of so much coming at them. I ask in Christ's name, amen. Let's just review quickly, thinking again about past time and then about those tense stems that use the primary endings, those that are not past time. So we have our aorist and imperfect are the past time, and they use secondary endings. We differentiate those from the present and the future, which use the primary endings. Let me erase that for you. Have a little bit better of a P there, the primary endings. So we have here this setup of secondary and primary endings. It's the secondary endings that clue us to past time. Our augment patterns that go along with that secondary ending. So whenever we think augment, we're thinking the secondary endings and not the primary, and we're thinking past time. Again, the epsilon, if a consonant begins the word, a lengthening of the connecting vowel, or rather the stem, the initial vowel, excuse me, the lengthening of the initial vowel. If the word begins with a vowel, then that vowel, like alpha, epsilon, omicron, is just lengthened appropriately, as you see here, and eta is already long and it just stays. The diphthongs I, A, and oi are also lengthened, and you can just recall those lengthenings. Ow and u are lengthened to au, and those are very rare. So just remember, our secondary endings go with the augment. Those will always go together. When we have our personal ending review here, we think again about primary and secondary. And by now you should be getting down. So far with the primary, we have covered the present, as I've noted here, and the future. And with the secondary, we've covered the imperfect and the aorist. Now today, we are going to be looking at both of these sets of endings because we're thinking about the future and the aorist and the passives in both. So here we're thinking about all of the endings, and you've noticed that Mounce has arranged the chapters sort of so that we build one level to the next. We began here with the present, and we were thinking just about primary endings. Then we went on to the future, and we were still thinking about primary endings. Then we thought about the imperfect and the secondary endings. And now we have come to the point where we're interacting with both sets of endings in this same chapter, here in chapter 24. I can't emphasize enough the importance of distinguishing between root and stem. I've drawn this diagram at each of our screencasts, and I think you're finding out why. If you take a look at page 450 and put maybe a bookmark there, and then have page 272 open as well, you'll be able to distinguish, again, the importance of the root and stem distinction. Take for a minute on page 457, if you want to just look at page 457 specifically, and then you can also just have the book, maybe a bookmark at 272 that you can come back to that. But on page 457, notice the word Lego and the leg stem. The word Lego is the lexical form of the word. It's the present. And leg is the only root that is used, or I should say it this way, only the present reaches down and grabs hold of leg. But notice as you look across on page 457, as you look across the columns, that most of the tense stems reach down here and grab air. Here, air is used for the future active and middle. It's used for the perfect active, the perfect middle passive, and the aorist and future passive that we're looking at here in chapter 24. There's one other root. I'm going to draw it with another color here just to distinguish these. Ip. And ip is used just by the aorist active and middle. So do you see why I began all of our study of Greek verbs thinking about the distinction between the root and the stem? Because there are different roots that can be used. And it is the case that though we learn the present first, that does not mean that all of these other stems or roots are built on the present. That is not the case. A particular stem can reach down like the present and grab its root. The aorist here, as we are thinking about in chapter 24, the aorist and future passive, reaches down here and grabs hold of air. So let's think about the first aorist passive for a moment. And initially, I want to draw your attention to the tense formative. This tense formative they ends in eta, which is a vowel. And if we have a tense formative ending in a vowel, we do not need, that's right, the connecting vowel, just like the first aorist active. The first aorist active, tense formative, sigma alpha, had that alpha, therefore we didn't need the connecting vowel. Same principle here with they. We are in the aorist, and the aorist is past time, so we have an augment, and the augment always corresponds with the secondary endings. Here is the other distinguishing factor of the first aorist passive. Besides the theta eta, we use active endings. Now I know this is a point of massive confusion. How is it that we have a passive tense stem using active endings? Well, the pattern is peculiar, and I don't have an exact answer. You will notice that we want to continue to appreciate everything consistent in Greek, like augment and secondary endings, because there are peculiarities, like here, the first and we'll see the second aorist passives. Both of these use active endings. Now, all hope is not lost because of this theta. Though we might be confused by the endings, if we see what seems to be a verb stem followed by theta eta, we can let our minds relax a bit here about the ending, because this theta eta is going to cue us that we are in the passive. So here, lu, thane. We have our augment, that's consistent, our stem, which there's a root behind that stem we know. Theta eta is going to be our exact clue that we are in the aorist passive, the first aorist passive. Now, as we noticed with first and second aorist, active and middle, there's no difference in meaning, only in form. Same with the passive. No difference in meaning, just in form. The difference here, theta eta, versus we'll see in a moment with the first, or the second aorist passive rather, just the eta is going to be our tense formative. First though, the first aorist passive, we see theta, eta all the way down. Our active endings, nu, sigma, nothing, which we remember would often look like epsilon because the epsilon was the connecting vowel. And then men, te. One other note, there's a distinguishing mark here in the third plural. Instead of nu, which in the classical secondary endings in the active, we would have a nu here and a nu here. There's this distinguishing factor with son. So theson. Now, if we come up and just look again here at the, no ending is used. No ending, and so we can have the, but there might be a nu there if in fact the next word begins with a vowel. We need to be aware that our stops pattern is yet relevant here with the aorist stem. If we have a stem that ends in a labial, P beta phi, a velar, kappa gamma chi, or a dental, tau delta theta, and it bumps up against a theta, which is going to be the initial letter in both the first aorist and we'll see the first future passive tense formatives, this theta, then there's going to be some interaction. Well, if this theta here comes up against P or B, it's going to be phi theta, and obviously phi theta is just going to stay the same. If we have the combination of a velar with theta, this kappa, this gamma coming up against theta will equal a chi theta, and obviously chi theta will be the same. The tau delta theta, that combination is, or theta theta is going to equal sigma theta. This is similar to the square stops, but see page 265 and you'll note how Mounts represents this. I have followed him exactly here, but you can take a look at page 265, and it's just worth memorizing these patterns and noticing that the square stops is altered a bit because of the interaction of theta, not sigma, but theta, with the labials, velars, and dentals. Let's continue on thinking here then about the second aorist passive. We've thought about the first aorist and now on to the second aorist passive. Again, we're mindful of the distinction between root and stem. They might be the same, but there might be a distinction there. Here, we again do not have the connecting vowel. We don't need it because the tense formative acts as a connecting vowel between the stem and the endings. We are mindful that here with the aorist passive, just as we saw with the aorist active, the passive uses active endings. You say, well, how am I going to know the difference? There are two factors that will help you to know the difference. One is the tense stem might be altered. The second is this tense formative will definitely be altered. We will not have a connecting vowel, or I should say not the tense stem's going to, or rather the connecting vowel is going to be altered. There's going to be an altering of the connection between the stem and the endings because we won't have a connecting vowel. Instead, we will have eta there as the connection. So, graph, amen. And it's this eta right here where we would expect a connecting vowel will help us to remember this is something different, and this is the tense formative for the second aorist passive indicative. So here's the paradigm for the second aorist passive. Again, the tense formative We don't need a connecting vowel because the tense formative itself is a vowel, and it connects our stem with the personal endings, eta, all the way down. Our endings are consistent, save this alteration here that we have seen already in the third plural from new to son. Otherwise, just consistent all the way through. Let's think about the futures now. We've looked at the first and second aorist passives. Now let's think about the first future passive. And again, the distinguishing factor here is going to be this tense formative. Not they, as with the first aorist passive, but face. And you can think of that sigma. Yes, that's the same as our future active indicative uses that sigma. So that's one way to remember this. Now, for the last several chapters here, we've been thinking about the aorist, and the aorist begins with an augment here, but with the future, we don't have an augment because we're with the primary endings. Remember that? So the augment always goes with secondary, but since we're in the primary, there's no augment. So we take up the stem, and again, that stem might be different than the root of the present, but it's going to be a stem that is based upon a root. Again, it might be inconsistent with the present, but not all verbs have to reach down. Not all tense stems like the future have to get the same root as the present does. Again, that's the basis of what we've been thinking about on pages 450 and following that I noted earlier, but you'll see that especially with the future. We have our connecting vowel, and we use our primary endings. So here's the key to a future passive indicative, that face that will just stand out to you. That combination of letters, where you see that, begin to think first future passive. And just as the aorist, first and second, with the future, first and second. No distinction in meaning, only in form. Paradigm then of the first future passive indicative. We have our tense formative. Why do we have a tense formative and a connecting vowel? In the aorist, we had a tense formative, so we didn't need a connecting vowel, because in the aorist, the ending of the tense formative was eta. But here, we need a connecting vowel because the end of the tense formative is a sigma. And so we have the pattern here that we have seen all the way through: omicron, epsilon, epsilon, omicron, epsilon, omicron, OEE, OEO, and we just have face coming into contact with that very consistently and easily bringing those two letter combinations together. And then we have our personal endings again for the primary. My, psi, tai, methasitha, ntai are primary middle or passive endings right here. One note, and this is just a pattern we have seen consistently. With the second singular, psi is our ending. That sigma is intervocalic and drops out. This alpha is strong, forces that epsilon to become eta, and the iota subscripts right underneath. And that's how we get to luthese right here. Components of the second future passive, just as we have seen in the first future passive, with one alteration. Ace, not face, but just ace. And that is our second future passive. Again, no difference in meaning, just in form. One note that I have here, just as again to keep us fresh with the distinction between root and stem, here the stem vowel, epsilon, ablautes, lengthens to alpha, to apostol with the future here instead of apostel. So we have apostol asomai, and you see ace right there, thinking second future passive. So our paradigm for a second future passive, we have again our tense formative all the way down, wonderfully consistent with the connecting vowel. The same pattern with psi that we saw earlier. Again, the sigma between two vowels drops out. Alpha forces the epsilon to lengthen to eta, and that iota subscript's right underneath. Our master verb chart, I have this up again just so you can see the big picture. Wherever we have an augment, we have secondary endings. Where we have a tense formative that ends in a vowel, like alpha, like eta, then we do not have a connecting vowel, don't need one. Our vocab starter, keep in mind that Mounts has signified verbal roots and noun stems by this asterisk. So here, ago, I go, is a verb, so this is a verbal root. Hyma is blood, that's a noun. Hymat is a noun stem. Keep that in mind because as we talk about the verb root stem distinction, that can get confusing. So just keep in mind that throughout the textbook, this asterisk on a verb clues us to the root. On a noun, it clues us to the noun stem. And we need to keep in mind that regarding verbs, there's a difference between root and stem in many places, as again, page 450 and following will provide you the scope for. Keep pressing on with these verbs and distinguishing between the present, the imperfect, the aorist, the future, and see the interplay. That is really the work of exegesis and the value of knowing these verbal stems.